Sophia Whitmore had not planned to come home early. But there she stood in the doorway of the sunlit sitting room briefcase, still in hand, completely still. Jacob Reed, the estate's cleaner, a quiet man she barely knew by name, was kneeling beside her mother's armchair, his face turned slightly away. Tears moved down his jaw in silence. Margaret's thin hand held his with a grip that looked like certainty. And Margaret was smiling. Not the polite, medicated smile Sophia had grown used to seeing. Something real. Something Sophia had not been able to give her in months. Sophia did not move from the doorway for a long moment. She watched Jacob slowly become aware of her presence, his shoulders straightening his free hand, moving to wipe his face in a single quiet motion. He did not scramble to his feet or offer an explanation. He simply looked at her with steady eyes, nodded once, as if acknowledging something that needed no apology, and then gently released Margaret's hand and stood. Margaret turned toward the door and saw her daughter, and the smile on her face did not fade. That was the part Sophia could not stop thinking about afterward. The smile stayed. She set her briefcase down in the hallway and said nothing. Jacob excused himself and left the room without being asked, his footsteps barely audible on the hardwood floor. Sophia walked to her mother's chair and leaned down to kiss her cheek. Margaret's skin was cool and paper-thin beneath her lips. The room smelled like chamomile and something faintly floral, a scent Sophia did not immediately recognize, though she would later learn it came from the small pot of dried lavender Jacob had placed on the windowsill, because Margaret had once mentioned in passing that it helped her breathe easier in the afternoons. "You're back early," Margaret said. Her voice was soft but clear, carrying none of the strained effort Sophia had noticed over recent months. Sophia pulled a chair close and sat down. The meeting wrapped up faster than expected. She studied her mother's face, the color in her cheeks, the relaxed set of her jaw. "You look well today." Margaret glanced toward the door through which Jacob had disappeared. "Jacob read to me this morning, from the garden book I've had since your father was alive. I didn't think anyone even knew where I'd kept it." She folded her hands in her lap with a kind of calm that looked almost effortless. "He found it on the shelf in the blue room and asked if I'd like him to read from it, just like that." Sophia did not respond right away. She looked at her mother's hands, the same hands that had braided her hair when she was small, that had signed school permission slips and held her face during fevers, and realized she had not held them in longer than she could honestly remember. Sophia Whitmore had built her company the same way she had built most things in her life, through precision endurance and a refusal to let sentiment interfere with strategy. Whitmore Tech was valued at just over $4 billion by the time she turned 38. She had appeared on the covers of 3 major business publications in the last 2 years alone, and had closed acquisitions on 4 continents in the span of 18 months. People who worked with her described her as brilliant and relentless. People who worked for her used similar words, just in a different order. Her mother had never said anything like that about her. Margaret Whitmore had always described Sophia simply as her daughter, with the particular weight of someone who meant it as the highest possible designation. Sophia had spent most of her adult life being vaguely uncomfortable with that kind of love. It asked nothing of her and expected everything, and she had never quite known how to hold it without feeling the pressure of all the ways she was falling short. The diagnosis had come 14 months ago. Stage 4. The doctors had been careful with their language and generous with their timelines, but Sophia had read the actual reports herself and understood precisely what they meant. She had immediately arranged for the best palliative care team in Connecticut, had the estate's ground floor converted into a comfortable living space so Margaret would not have to manage stairs, and had hired a full household staff to ensure her mother wanted for nothing. She had done all of this in the span of 1 week, managing the logistics from her office in Manhattan with the same efficiency she brought to any complex operational problem. What she had not done, what she kept meaning to do, and kept not doing, was simply come home and sit down. Jacob Reed had been on the estate staff for 11 months. He was 35, lean, and quiet in the way that some people are quiet, not from shyness, but from a long habit of getting through things without making a scene. His wife had left 4 years earlier, citing a distance between them that she said had nothing to do with geography. He had not argued the point. He took the job at the Whitmore estate through a staffing agency, and his listed responsibilities were general maintenance and grounds upkeep, clearing gutters, managing the heating system, keeping the exterior in order through the Connecticut winters. He was not hired to sit with Margaret Whitmore. He had started doing it anyway, gradually, and without announcement, the way that certain things happen when a person pays enough attention to notice what is actually needed. It had begun simply. One afternoon in his second month, he had been repairing a window latch in the corridor outside Margaret's sitting room and heard her trying to reach something on a high shelf, a book, as it turned out. He had knocked, retrieved it for her, and she had said thank you in a way that suggested she had not spoken to anyone in several hours. He had asked if it was a good book. She had told him it was her late husband's favorite. He had said he would like to hear about it sometime if she ever felt like talking. She had looked at him for a moment, as if trying to determine whether he was being polite or genuine, and then she had asked him to sit down. He had stayed for 40 minutes that day. After that, the visits became a quiet regularity, never scheduled, never discussed with anyone else on the staff, simply part of the rhythm of his days on the estate. He had lost his own mother when he was 10 years old, taken suddenly by an illness that no one had thought to explain to him until it was already over. That absence had never entirely closed. It had simply become part of the architecture of who he was, a room inside him that remained furnished but empty, that he passed through sometimes without meaning to. Margaret Whitmore didn't fill that room, but sitting with her, listening to her, making sure she had what she needed in the hours when no one else thought to ask those things, gave the room a kind of use it had not had before. He did not articulate this to himself in those terms. He simply kept showing up. 3 days after Sophia returned home, she called Jacob into the study. The room was one of the more formal spaces in the house. Dark wood, tall bookshelves, a desk that had belonged to her father, and still smelled faintly of the pipe tobacco he had favored. Sophia sat behind it in a way that made the setting feel less like a home and more like a boardroom. Jacob came in wearing his work clothes, a faint streak of exterior paint on his left forearm, and sat across from her when she gestured to the chair. Sophia had prepared what she intended to say. She had in fact written a few notes, which she did not look at, because she did not need to. "I want to talk about the time you've been spending with my mother." Jacob nodded. "I figured. Your contract covers maintenance and grounds. What you've been doing with her goes well beyond that." She kept her tone even, not unkind, but direct. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I just want to understand what's been happening." Jacob looked at her in the calm, unhurried way she had noticed the first time she saw him. "I come in early some mornings, about an hour before my shift. I sit with her, have tea talk if she wants to talk. Sometimes she asks me to read. I stay a bit after my shift a few times a week to do the same." He said it plainly, without defensiveness. "I didn't ask for permission because it didn't feel like something that needed a meeting. It felt like something that needed doing." Sophia kept her expression neutral. "That's not what I pay you for." "No," he agreed. "It's not." The simplicity of his answer caught her slightly off guard. She had expected more justification, perhaps, or some degree of discomfort. Instead, he held her gaze and said nothing further, as if he had already made his position clear and saw no need to embroider it. "My mother is receiving professional care," Sophia said. "She has a full medical team, a nurse on call, everything she needs." Jacob's response came measured and without edge. "She has everything she needs medically. That's not the same thing." He did not say it as a challenge. He said it the way someone states a thing they believe to be simply true. "I've sat with her enough to know she's not lonely for company, Exactly, she's lonely to feel like herself, like a person with a history and opinions, and things she still cares about, not just a patient in her own home. Sophia opened her mouth to answer, and then the door to the study opened. Margaret stood in the doorway, steadied by the narrow cane she had started using in the last 2 months. Her expression was composed, but her eyes were direct, and it was immediately clear to Sophia that her mother had heard enough of the conversation to know what was being decided. "Sophia." Margaret's voice was quiet, but carried the particular authority that had nothing to do with volume. "Jacob is the only person in this house who asks me what I think about things. Not what I need. Not how I'm feeling what I think. About the garden, about books, about the state of the world." She moved to the edge of the doorway and rested her hand on the frame. "I'm still a person. He treats me like one. That matters more than you understand right now." Sophia looked at her mother for a long moment. Then she looked back at Jacob, who had not turned around to watch Margaret speak, and did not appear to require any validation from the exchange. "Continue what you've been doing," Sophia said finally. The words came out more quietly than she had intended. Jacob stood, nodded once to Sophia, and then to Margaret, and left the room. That evening, Sophia sat alone in the kitchen, long after the rest of the house had gone quiet. She poured herself a glass of water, and stood at the counter and didn't drink it. She was trying to work through something that did not have a clean shape. Not anger, not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to both that felt worse than either because it had no obvious target. She had done everything correctly. She had made all the right arrangements, spent the right amounts of money, hired the right people. She had protected her mother from financial stress and medical inadequacy, and every practical inconvenience that could be controlled. She had done this, she knew, partly from love, and partly because solving those problems felt like progress, and progress was the language she had always been most fluent in. What Jacob had done wasn't progress in any measurable sense. He had simply shown up and stayed. He had asked her mother about a book, and then come back the next day to hear more about it. He had learned how she liked her tea, and then made it that way without being asked. These were not strategic interventions. They were not solutions to any quantifiable problem. They were just presence offered consistently without an agenda. Sophia set down the glass of water and went to stand at the window that looked out over the back garden. The night was clear, and the garden was dark, but she could make out the shape of the grounds her mother had spent decades tending: the wide south-facing beds, the stone path that ran along the perimeter, the tall hedgerow along the property's edge that her father had planted the year they moved in, and along the far eastern wall, barely visible in the darkness, the outline of the climbing rows that Margaret had trained up the brickwork sometime in the 1980s, and that had been growing there season after season ever since. Sophia had walked past it thousands of times. She could not have described it in any detail until this moment. She noticed for the first time that the beds along that eastern wall had recently been cleared. The dead growth was gone. The edges were clean, and even in the dark, she could tell that someone had put real time into it. She had not asked anyone to do that. She had not even thought to. She stood there for a while, looking at the garden, thinking about all the things she had not thought to do. In the weeks that followed, Sophia began to watch Jacob the way she watched markets, not obsessively, but with the particular attention of someone who has identified a variable they do not yet understand. She told herself it was due diligence. She was responsible for her mother's well-being, and Jacob was now a significant presence in that environment, and it was simply reasonable to observe how he operated. She believed this explanation for about 4 days before she stopped bothering to justify it to herself. What she noticed first was the consistency. Jacob arrived before his shift began. Nearly every morning, changed into his work clothes, and stopped by Margaret's sitting room before doing anything else. He did not stay long in the mornings, 15 minutes, sometimes 20. But the visit was always the first thing he did. not an afterthought fit in between tasks. He brought tea. He had learned without being told that Margaret preferred hers with a half-spoon of honey and no milk, steeped exactly long enough to be strong without going bitter. Sophia had lived in this house for the first 18 years of her life and had not known that about her mother until she watched Jacob carry the cup in one morning and heard Margaret say without looking up from her book, "You got the steeping time right again?" The garden was the other thing. What Sophia had noticed from the kitchen window that first night had been only the beginning. Jacob had identified, apparently on his own, that Margaret had once maintained the entire east-facing section of the grounds herself before the diagnosis, before the fatigue, made it impossible, and that losing access to that space had been a quiet, unspoken grief. He had begun restoring it, section by section, working on it during his lunch breaks and on weekend mornings when he came in without being scheduled. He did not present it to Margaret as a project or ask for her input in advance. He simply worked on it until it reached a point where she could see real progress from her window. And then one afternoon, he brought her a cutting from the climbing rose along the eastern wall and set it in a small glass of water on her windowsill without explanation. Margaret had looked at it for a long time. Then she had said, "That one's been there since before Sophia was born." Jacob had nodded and gone back to work. Sophia had been standing in the hallway when that exchange happened. She had not announced herself. She walked back to the kitchen and stood there for a moment, with her hand flat on the counter, pressing down without quite knowing why. She started spending more time in the house. Not dramatically, she did not cancel entire weeks of obligations or make pronouncements about her priorities. She simply began finding reasons to delay her departures and reasons to return earlier than her schedule required. She sat in on meals when Margaret was having a good day. She asked the nurse for updates in person rather than by email. She moved some of her calls and video meetings to the study at the estate instead of the Manhattan office, which her assistant noted without comment, and her board members noted with varying degrees of visible concern. Being present, she discovered, was harder than she had expected. Not logistically, it was simple. She was there, she was available. The proximity was not the problem. The problem was that she did not know what to do with herself once she was there. She would sit with her mother for 20 minutes and find herself checking her phone not because anything urgent needed her attention, but because the silence of just sitting felt unfamiliar and slightly vertiginous, like standing at the edge of something with no clear task to perform. Margaret never said anything about the phone. That was almost worse. Jacob did not check his phone when he sat with Margaret. He was simply there in the way that certain people are there, fully occupying the space, not performing attentiveness, but actually practicing it. Sophia watched him one afternoon from the hallway through the partially open door as he sat beside Margaret's chair and listened to her describe a trip she and Sophia's father had taken to Vermont in what must have been the mid-1980s. Margaret's voice had taken on a texture it did not usually carry, richer, slower moving through the memory, like it was somewhere she was actually returning to. Jacob did not interject or redirect. He asked one question when she finished something about whether the inn they had stayed in was still there, and Margaret had laughed a small, genuine laugh and said she had no idea, but she hoped so. Sophia could not remember the last time she had heard her mother laugh. She stood in the hallway for a moment, after that, not moving, aware that she had just witnessed something she had not known to look for and could not have manufactured if she tried. Then she walked quietly back to the study and sat down at her father's desk and looked at the wall for a long time without opening her laptop. The conversation that changed something between Sophia and Jacob happened on a Thursday evening in late October when the temperature had dropped sharply and most of the household staff had gone home for the night. Sophia had come downstairs for water and found Jacob in the kitchen, still in his work clothes, eating a late dinner that looked like something he had put together from whatever was available. He had a habit she had learned, of staying later than his shift required, without explanation checking the heating system before he left, making sure the night nurse had what she needed, looking in on Margaret one final time. He had never mentioned any of this. Sophia had only noticed because she had started paying attention. He offered to leave when she came in. She told him not to bother and poured herself a glass of water and sat down at the other end of the table. For a few minutes, neither of them said anything, which felt less awkward than it probably should have. Then Sophia asked him something she had been carrying around for a while without intending to voice it. "Why does it matter to you? What happens to her?" Jacob set down his fork and considered the question without appearing to find it intrusive. "My mother died when I was 10 years old," he said. "I didn't get to say goodbye. She went into the hospital on a Tuesday, and by Friday she was gone, and I was 10. So no one thought to sit down and explain what was actually happening until it was already over." He said it without self-pity, in the same even tone he used for most things. "I didn't understand for a long time what I'd missed. I thought I was upset about losing her. It took me years to realize I was also upset about losing the chance to be there, to just be in the room with her while there was still time." Sophia looked at the table. The kitchen was quiet around them, the kind of quiet that only large, mostly empty houses produce at night, heavy and specific. Jacob continued, "Every time I walk into your mother's room, I'm aware that someone has the chance I didn't get. And if I can make that space feel less like a waiting room and more like somewhere a person actually lives, then I'm going to do that." He picked up his fork again. "That's all it is." Sophia stayed with that for a moment. She thought about saying something, and then she thought about what she would actually say, and she found there was nothing that would add to what had already been stated. So instead, she asked him about the rose he had cut from the eastern wall, which variety it was, how long the plant had been there. Jacob told her it was an old climbing hybrid, the kind that had been popular in the 1960s and 70s and was rarely planted anymore. He said he thought it had been there at least 40 years, based on the thickness of the main canes, possibly longer. He said old roses like that were actually easier to keep than people assumed. They just needed someone to pay attention to them consistently, which most people didn't bother to do. They talked about the garden for a while in the quiet kitchen, and it was the most honest conversation Sophia could remember having in a long time. Not because of what was said exactly, but because of what was not performed. Neither of them was managing the other. They were just two people sitting in a kitchen at night, talking about a rose. When she went back upstairs, she stood outside her mother's door for a moment. The light underneath it was off. Margaret was asleep. Sophia stood there with her hand raised, not quite touching the door, understanding for the first time with real clarity that the person who had been farthest from her mother's life over the past 14 months had not been the nurses or the doctors or the household staff. It had been her. The one person who had arranged everything and understood, on some operational level, that this was all she had to give, had given it, and believed that was enough. It was not enough. She had known this somewhere below the surface for a long time. She was only now allowing herself to know it at the level where it had to be dealt with. 2 weeks later, the board of Whitmore Tech called an emergency meeting. The European acquisition, a mid-sized software firm based in Munich that Sophia had been pursuing for nearly a year, had reached its final negotiation stage, and the other party had imposed a hard deadline. There were conflicting interests among several of the board members, structural complications with the terms, and a counterpart on the other side, who had made it clearly known that the deal would only close if Sophia herself led the final weeks of negotiation in person. The board presented this to her as the obvious next step. The acquisition was worth over $900 million. The timeline required a minimum of 3 weeks in Europe, possibly extending to 5. Sophia sat through the meeting without interrupting. She had her tablet in front of her, and she did not look at it. When the board finished presenting, she told them she would have an answer within 24 hours and ended the call. She sat in the study for a long time after that. The numbers were not complicated. She could do the math on the acquisition value in her head in under a minute. And by any objective financial measure, it was the most significant deal her company had pursued in 4 years. Missing it or sending someone in her place and watching the deal collapse would have consequences that would take years to untangle. She understood this clearly. She also understood that downstairs at this moment, her mother was having a difficult afternoon. The nurse had mentioned that morning that Margaret's breathing had been more labored than usual, and that the fatigue was increasing in a pattern that suggested things were moving faster than the most optimistic projections had assumed. Sophia looked at the phone on the desk. She thought about calling her deputy. She thought about the acquisition. She thought about what Jacob had said in the kitchen about being in the room while there was still time, and then she stopped thinking about the acquisition and started thinking about something she could not name precisely. But that felt like a door she was standing in front of again, and this time she was not sure it would remain open if she walked away from it. She did not call her deputy that night. She told herself she was still deciding, but she already knew what the weight in her chest meant. She had always been good at reading data. The data in front of her, stripped of the financial figures, was very simple. Her mother's time was finite and measurable, and she was running out of the most basic thing. Not money, not resources, not capability. Just time that had not yet been spent in the wrong direction. The board could wait for 24 hours. She went downstairs and knocked on her mother's door and asked if she could come in. Margaret said yes. Sophia sat down in the chair beside her, the same chair where she had found Jacob, kneeling on the day she came home early and did not check her phone for the rest of the evening. They talked for a while about small things, the garden, a book Margaret had been reading, a memory she had of Sophia at age 7, insisting on wearing a specific red coat to every occasion regardless of the weather. Sophia had forgotten about the coat entirely. Hearing about it now from her mother's voice felt like recovering something she had not known was missing. It was not a grand gesture. It was not a resolution. It was just one evening where she stayed, and for the moment that was the only decision she was capable of making and the only one that felt true. But then, 3 days later, everything changed. It was past midnight when the sound came from the floor below, a sharp, alarmed voice from the night nurse, and then the sound of movement that had none of the usual calm of the house at rest. Sophia was on her feet before she was fully awake. She was out the door and down the stairs in seconds. Through the open doorway of her mother's room, she could see the nurse on the phone, her voice low and fast, and Margaret in the bed with her eyes open, but her chest moving in a way that looked labored and wrong. Jacob was already there. He had been sleeping in his truck in the estate's service drive, something he had apparently been doing on nights when Margaret was having a difficult stretch, close enough to respond quickly if something happened far enough away that no one had to acknowledge the arrangement formally. Sophia would learn this afterward. In the moment, she only registered that he was there, sitting on the edge of the bed, with Margaret's hand in both of his, saying her name in a steady, quiet voice that was not panicked, but was clearly trying to hold something together through sheer consistency of tone. Sophia crossed the room and took her mother's other hand. The ambulance arrived 11 minutes later. The hospital waiting room was the kind of place designed to make time feel meaningless. The chairs were upholstered in a color that had no name. The lighting was flat and permanent, and the wall clock moved in a way that seemed unconnected to any real experience of minutes passing. Sophia sat in one of those chairs for 4 hours, with her coat still on her phone in her hand, and no calls made. Jacob sat 2 seats away. Neither of them spoke much. There was nothing useful to say, and they both seemed to understand this without having to agree on it. The doctor came out a little after 4 in the morning. He was careful and thorough, and kind in the particular way that doctors are kind when they are telling you something true that you already know. Margaret had stabilized. The respiratory episode had been serious, but they had managed it. She was resting. However, and this was the word that restructured the rest of the conversation, The underlying progression had accelerated. The doctor said they were looking at weeks rather than months. He said it was time to think about what Margaret wanted the remainder of her time to look like, and whether she wanted to spend it at home. He recommended they make those decisions soon, while Margaret was still clear and able to participate in them. Sophia thanked him. She shook his hand. She waited until he had walked back through the double doors before she put her face in her hands. She did not cry loudly. She was not someone who cried loudly. But Jacob heard the change in her breathing and moved to the seat beside her and did not say anything, which was exactly right. After a minute, she straightened and looked at the wall and said, "I kept thinking I had more time to figure out how to do this." Jacob said, "Most people do." It was not comforting exactly, but it was honest, and she appreciated the honesty more than she would have appreciated comfort. Margaret came home 4 days later. She had been clear when asked that she wanted to be at the estate. She wanted her own room and her own garden visible from the window, and the particular quality of light that came through the east-facing glass in the late afternoon. The medical team adjusted the care plan accordingly. A hospital bed was brought in and positioned so that Margaret could see the garden from where she lay. The climbing rose along the eastern wall was visible from that angle, the same one Jacob had cut the stem from weeks earlier, now trimmed back cleanly and showing the first signs of new growth along the lower branches. Sophia canceled everything. Not selectively, not the less important meetings while keeping the critical ones, but everything across the board for an indefinite period. She called her deputy and transferred operational authority for the European acquisition and for the quarterly planning cycle. She sent one message to the board explaining that she was taking a family leave and that her deputy had full authority to act in her absence. The board responded with concern, and in some cases, barely concealed alarm. She read their responses and did not reply to any of them. It was the first time in her professional life that she had walked away from something unfinished without a plan for how it would be finished. The feeling was not relief exactly. It was more like stepping off a surface she had been standing on for so long that she had forgotten it was possible to stand somewhere else. Jacob was the one who taught her how to be in the room. He did not frame it that way. He did not frame it as anything. He simply kept doing what he had always done. And over the days that followed, Sophia began watching him the way she had watched him in the early weeks, except now she was not observing from a distance. She was in the room. She saw at close range how he managed the particular difficulty of being present with someone who was dying without making the dying the center of every interaction. He talked to Margaret about things that had nothing to do with her condition. He asked her opinion on whether the hydrangeas along the south wall should be cut back before winter or left until spring. He brought in the newspaper some mornings and read her the parts she found interesting. Not the obituaries, not the health section, but the arts coverage and the long features on places she had always wanted to visit. When Margaret was too tired to talk, he sat with her in a quiet that did not feel like waiting. It felt like company. Sophia started doing some of these things herself. Slowly, imperfectly, with the particular self-consciousness of someone learning a skill in front of the person they most wanted to impress. She brought tea in the mornings. She had learned the steeping time finally, and got it right on the third attempt, and Margaret had looked at the cup and then at her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was something close and warmer. She sat beside the bed in the afternoons and asked her mother about things she had always meant to ask about, and had kept deferring what her own parents had been like, how she and Sophia's father had met, what she had wanted to be, before life moved her in a different direction. Margaret answered all of these questions with a completeness that suggested she had been waiting for them for a long time. Sometimes the answers went on for an hour. Sophia listened without looking at her phone. There were hard days. Days when Margaret's breathing was difficult and conversation was impossible. And all Sophia could do was sit there with her mother's hand in hers and be inside the helplessness of it without trying to fix anything. Those were the days that cost the most. She had spent her entire adult life converting helplessness into action, identifying the problem, allocating the resources, implementing the solution. There was no solution here. There was only the sitting, and the holding, and the being present inside something she could not control or resolve or make better through any application of will or intelligence or money. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, and it was also, she understood with a clarity that surprised her, the most important. On one of those hard days when the afternoon had gone quiet, and Margaret had drifted into a shallow sleep, Sophia sat in the chair beside the bed and looked at her mother's face for a long time. The lines around her eyes, the particular way her breath moved, the way her hand rested open on the blanket. She thought about all the afternoons that had passed in this house over the last 14 months while she had been somewhere else in conference rooms on planes, in hotel rooms, in cities that all looked the same after midnight. She had been building things. She had believed that what she was building was enough to constitute a life well managed. Sitting here now, she understood that she had confused management with presence, and that they were not the same thing, and had never been. One evening, about 2 weeks after Margaret came home from the hospital, Sophia found Jacob in the garden after dark. He had brought a small lamp out and was working on the beds by its light, doing something careful and precise with the soil around the base of the climbing plant along the eastern wall. Sophia came and stood nearby without interrupting him. After a moment, he looked up. "She told me today that she's not afraid," Sophia said. It had been on her mind since the afternoon. She said she's tired, but she's not afraid. I don't know how she does that. Jacob set down the small tool he had been using and sat back. "I think she's had time to make her peace with things," he said. "And I think knowing you're here has something to do with it." Sophia looked at the rose. In the lamplight, it was difficult to see the details, but the structure of it was clear, the way it had been trained along the wall over decades, the layers of growth, the old wood, and the new. "I keep thinking about all the years I wasn't," she said. Jacob did not offer reassurance on this point, which she respected. "Those years happened," he said. "But so did the last few weeks. Both of those things are true at the same time." He stood and brushed the soil from his hands. "She knows which one she's living in right now." They stood there for a few minutes in the quiet of the garden. The night was cold and clear, and the lamp threw a circle of warm light around the base of the rose and left everything beyond it in darkness. Sophia thought about what she would carry out of this season of her life when it was over. Not the acquisition she had walked away from, not the quarterly targets she had handed to someone else. Something else, something she did not have a clean word for yet, but that felt like it had been built in the garden and in the kitchen, and in the hours of sitting beside a bed with her mother's hand in hers, built the way the rose had been built slowly over years by someone paying attention. Margaret died on a Tuesday morning in November, when the light through the east-facing window was exactly the way she had said she liked it. Sophia was holding her hand. Jacob was in the room, standing near the window. The nurse stepped back and let the space belong to the three of them, and then to the two of them, and then only to Margaret, and then it was over. Sophia sat with her for a long time afterward. She did not move or speak. The room was very quiet, and the light kept coming through the window in the same unhurried way, and the climbing rose was visible along the wall outside its new growth, still small and pale against the older wood. Sophia looked at it for a long time. She thought about the day Jacob had cut the stem and set it in a glass of water on the windowsill, and what Margaret had said that the rose had been there since before Sophia was born. Some things outlasted the people who planted them. Some things simply kept growing. The weeks that followed the funeral had their own texture, administrative and quiet and grief-edged, in the way that weeks after loss tend to be full of paperwork and thank you notes and practical decisions that feel like an insult to the scale of what has happened, but must be handled anyway. Sophia moved through them methodically, which was the only way she knew how to move through things. She did not return to the full pace of Whitmore Tech. She could have her deputy had managed the European acquisition competently in her absence, and the board was relieved to have her attention back. But she found that she was not interested in returning to the shape her life had held before. Something had been rearranged in her, and the old configuration no longer fit. In January, she called Jacob and asked him to meet her at the estate. She had been thinking she'd told him about a foundation, named for Margaret, focused on the kind of care that the medical system did not cover and did not think to ask about the presence, the conversation, the being treated like a person that her mother had named as the thing that mattered most. She wanted to fund it properly and build it into something real. She wanted trained people deployed to patients who had everything they needed clinically and nothing they needed humanly. She wanted it to exist in a lasting way, the way the rose along the eastern wall existed, because someone had taken the time to tend to it consistently over years without being asked. Jacob listened to all of this without interrupting. When she finished, he said he thought it was a good idea. Then she told him she wanted him to help run the program not in a logistical or administrative capacity, but as the person who understood what the work actually required, who had done it without a template and gotten it right. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the garden through the window of the sitting room where Margaret's chair still stood. "I'm a cleaner," he said. Not as a protest, more like a fact he was placing on the table to be examined. "You were," Sophia said, "and you were better at the thing that mattered most than anyone I've ever hired." She met his eyes. "That's not nothing. That's actually everything." Jacob looked at the chair for a moment longer. Then he nodded. The following autumn, Sophia stood in the garden on a clear morning with the kind of light that makes everything look like it has been recently cleaned. The climbing rose along the eastern wall had come through the winter and was showing new growth along its upper reaches, higher than it had been the year before, reaching further along the wall in both directions. She had not planted it. She had not tended it. It had been here before her, and it would likely be here after her, doing what it had always done, which was simply continue. She thought about what her mother had said in the last clear conversation they had shared, that the thing that had made her happiest was not the money or the arrangements or the careful management of her care. It was that Sophia had found her way back to her heart. Margaret had used that phrase without any self-consciousness, the way she used most phrases, as if the language said exactly what she meant, and there was no need to dress it up or qualify it. Sophia had not been able to respond at the time. She had just held her mother's hand and nodded, and Margaret had seemed to understand that as sufficient. Standing in the garden now, Sophia thought it was the most accurate description of what had happened. She had found her way back to something. It had taken a man she had nearly dismissed, a garden she had not noticed, and a window of time that had been shorter than she ever allowed herself to believe. But she had found it. And unlike most of the things she had built in her life, this one did not require maintenance to remain standing. It had simply become part of the structure of who she was. The Foundation's first cohort of care companions would begin their training in 3 weeks. Jacob had spent the last 8 months developing the program with a quiet thoroughness that surprised no one who had watched him work. Sophia had matched his effort with resources and infrastructure, and the particular drive she brought to anything she committed herself to fully. Together, they had built something that neither of them could have built alone, which seemed right, which seemed, in fact, like the most accurate summary of everything that had happened since the afternoon she had come home early and stood in a doorway and seen a man kneeling beside her mother's chair with tears on his face, and her mother smiling in a way she had not smiled in months. She had not understood it then. She understood it now. Some things only make sense from the other side of them. She turned away from the rose and walked back toward the house where there was work to do, and she was finally the right person to do it.